everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the path to recovery as we battle the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we're looking at a leader's post-pandemic playbook to building brand and reputation. As many of you know, my name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist at the Smith School of Business at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to remind you, as I always do, that this webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. I also will remind you that this conversation will be recorded. You will all be receiving a copy of this recording in your inbox a couple of days, a day or two after we wrap up the webinar. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And finally, I want to remind you to please ask questions. It's really an opportunity to get to speak to somebody, to ask questions directly of somebody very knowledgeable. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. We will get to questions in the last 15 or so minutes of the presentation, so around 1:45. So ask a question at any time, and then we will get to them all in a big batch at the end. The sooner you get your questions in, the better the chance they're going to be answered. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Daniel Tisch. Daniel is widely known as a leader in the Canadian and global communications community. He is the CEO and principal owner of Argyle, one of Canada's largest communications consulting firms. He previously served as chair of the Global Alliance for Public Relations and Communication Management, the Confederation of the World's Public Relations Professional Associations. Whew, that's a mouthful, Dan. Dan began his career in the Canadian government and served in progressively more senior roles, culminating in a post as senior policy advisor and acting chief of staff to the Canadian foreign minister in the 1990s. In 25 years as a consultant, he has advised a long list of Global 500 and Fortune 500 companies, U15 research institutions, and both Canadian and international government leaders. Dan is particularly well known for his expertise in reputation issues and crisis management, including serving as lead communications advisor to an industry affected by the largest food recall in North American history. His other areas of practice include reputation management strategy, stakeholder engagement, governance, and executive leadership communications. Dan holds an executive MBA from Smith School of Business. He is the vice chair of the Queen's Board of Trustees and a frequent guest lecturer on leadership at Smith. And it is a great pleasure to be able to welcome Dan to our screen. And now I'm going to turn myself off and let you have the floor, Dan.
Okay, thank you very much, Meredith. And you'll let me know if for some reason my sound isn't coming through. And I'm going to just spend a moment here sharing my screen. And you'll let me know, I hope, if you don't see a great big Smith logo in the middle there, alongside my company's logo and the title, Ready for the Recovery. So I'm really excited by the opportunity to speak with you today. Yep, thanks. I see the note saying it's perfect, so that's great. You know, this is, for me, it's a really timely topic. You know, I'm having a lot of conversations with leaders across the country right now on this very topic, right? Because, you know, depending on where you live for many weeks and months, you know, leaders have been shifting their business strategies and their communication strategies during the pandemic. And I guess my observation is, just as crises bring out the best and worst in individuals and people that you see on the street, they bring out the best and worst in organizations and brands. And I think those who are foolish and less farsighted have gone into hiding. They've been paralyzed by fear or making a mistake. But it's really quite exciting the way farsighted businesses and leaders and brands have leaned into this and looked at it as an opportunity to demonstrate their values and to deliver value. And I think those are the ones, and research shows, those are the ones who are going to be best positioned for recovery. And that's really what this presentation is about. I'm going to walk through what I believe and I'll show you some research along the way, what our research has shown leaders should be thinking about and directing their communications and marketing teams to think about, to position their organizations for reputation and brand leadership and growth and success. So let's go. Only one slide about me and my firm. You know, I'm an early adopter of the Queen's Executive MBA model, class of '96. And really for me, the learning and relationships that I've enjoyed with Smith faculty and students and staff have been very foundational and formative, really, in my business and career. I bought a 10-person communications boutique in 2002, and the joys and the challenges of the entrepreneurial life remain as intoxicating as ever 18 years later. So that's my journey. And I guess unlike a lot of, unlike some business owners, but like many who grow up as professionals, right, in their early years of their career, and then go into ownership of a business in that profession. For me, I'm first and foremost about the craft, right? It's about understanding that reputation is among the greatest assets, the greatest intangible assets that any business has today, right? And so more and more, as the components of market value have shifted to these intangible assets, we really focus on helping clients manage it, rooted in authentic values of the organization and the brand, and the genuine value for customers and stakeholders, right? So this stuff matters. And I guess one thing that frustrates me as a communicator is the number of cliches you see in business communication. And if you're like me, perhaps you're frustrated at the number of marketing emails or COVID-19 related emails that begin with, in these challenging times, right? Or in these difficult times, in these unprecedented times, right? And then they go on to tell you or to try to sell you whatever they're going to try to tell you or sell you anyway, right? You know, little adaptation, no creativity. And so, you know, my best advice on that is to avoid cliches like the plague. And if there's another cliche that really bugs me, it's the idea of there being a new normal, right? We hear this again and again and again, and this is just a random Google search that I've captured images from the Google search. New normal, new normal, new normal. All over the world, you know, there are people grasping for this idea of a new normal. And in a more worrisome vein, though, you have leaders postponing decisions, business or communications or marketing decisions, until we know what this new normal looks like. Well, you know what? It's not as though this sort of thing has never happened in human history before, right? And this idea that that things are going to get back to some state of normalcy that we can accurately predict now, I think is something we have to fight against, right? This is a scene from Hollywood in 1946. There was a flu epidemic and the actors are rehearsing wearing masks. There was another one 10 years before that. And it was interesting, I was reading some work from this Wilfrid Laurier University academic, Mark Humphreys, and he's been quoted a fair bit lately because he wrote this book about the Spanish flu and the politics of public health in Canada 100 years ago. And he's got a great line. He says, every prediction that came out of 1918 about the lasting effects of that flu and how the world would change, none of them ever transpired. And he's got this wonderful image, right? This wonderful simile. Society's like an elastic and it snaps back very quickly. And so, you know, what I'd urge you to think about as kind of the first takeaway, if there's any takeaway from today, you know, one of them is that there's no new normal. There's just a rolling reality, right? A process of continuous change that we have to prepare ourselves for and prepare our organizations to deal with, right? And that we have to think that way. Is there change that will be lasting and enduring afterwards? Absolutely, right? There's already been change, right? Some of this may persist, some not. But Argyle did research earlier this year into relationships. This is a survey we did with Leger. We do one every year, and I'll talk about that a little bit later today. But we found that people's relationships with their family, their coworkers, their employers, even people who were losing their jobs or their jobs were threatened, you know, their relationships with their employer remained very strong throughout the pandemic. My healthcare provider, businesses I deal with, all of these relationships were strengthened. And kind of surprisingly, despite all the trolls out there on social media, you know, do a search on Trudeau, and these are the first three things that came up when I did a search recently, right? You know, but even our relationships with our governments, you know, have improved over the course of the crisis. And that's why you see premiers in New Brunswick and BC, you know, calling early elections, right? Now we'll see if it works or not. We'll see if this persists or not. We'll see if this survives the second wave of the pandemic. But leaders are doing pretty well right now. And habits, of course, are changing. Some of these will be permanent, some not so much. But I think it's important that we be aware of the change in habits, right? And look for opportunities that our businesses can seize, you know, whether it's medicine, telemedicine, whether it's teleeducation, whether it's anything that gives us an opportunity to change the game in favor for our businesses, right? And there is a previous Smith webinar, Brian Pearson, former CEO of Loyalty One, was on. This is a couple of months back, and he had a great line that I want to credit Brian for. He said, it's kind of this is sort of a jump ball situation. And as a Raptors fan, at the time star for basketball, I love that analogy, right? Because it's a time when it doesn't matter who had the ball before or the competitive advantage, right? For a moment, the play stops and all of the competitors have a fresh chance to change the game. So yesterday I was on a call and in a Zoom meeting with Longos, and Anthony Longo, the CEO of Longos, was on the call. And, he was talking about how his company is adapting in I think, a very smart way to that jump ball moment, right? People are eating more at home. The art of cooking is coming back, right? Registration in online cooking classes, especially among younger adults, is very high. But there's something that's happened over the course of the pandemic, right? People are eating at home. They're still nervous about going into restaurants, but they don't want to work so hard. They want that indulgence that they used to get, and that convenience and ability to focus on their partner or their family or their socially distanced friend, rather than focusing on the cooking. And so they're investing more and more in this sort of thing, which is on their website right now, which you can order online. Festive meal kits, right, and takeout. Anything that ensures that people preparing meals don't have to work so hard. It's so smart and so well positioned. I know many people I've met over the years have started their own businesses or have bought businesses. And I think there's a really exciting opportunity for local businesses now to level the playing field. Now, at one level, local businesses have challenges, right? Because often they're less cost competitive than great big players. But this is my favorite men's clothing store in Toronto, Sydney's. Maybe some of you in Toronto shop there too. I got this shirt there about a month ago. And I love some of the things that they've been doing because they realize that the advantage that they have is they have customer loyalty, they have customer engagement, they've got relationship with their customers, right? And so they're focusing on how they can steward those relationships, neutralizing the advantage that bigger brands have, by offering free shipping. And then if you look down here, offering, this is earlier in the pandemic, when there were very severe limitations on what people could do and what people were willing to do, but offering private shopping experiences. And this is how I think local businesses have to be thinking. Looking at bigger businesses, many of you have leadership positions in big organizations. This is one of our clients, UPS. And I was so struck by an insight that they gained when their drivers, they listened to what their drivers were telling them about their experiences. And drivers noticed early in the pandemic that little kids were putting up signs saying thank you to the drivers, right? That you guys are, in your own way, you're essential workers. You're bringing stuff to our homes when we really need them, right? And so that moment of listening to their employees led to this, I think, brilliant insight that drove a campaign that was pure magic because in the same campaign, they're getting their customers to thank their drivers. So in one go and in one magic line, thanks for delivering, they're building and strengthening relationships with their two key audiences, their customers and their employees. It doesn't have to be golden brands that everybody loves. It can be brands that get more than their fair share of criticism, right? Like Facebook, right? Stepping up during the pandemic with small business grant programs, right? With support for Canadian artists, right? If you're part of an organization or a brand or an industry that's often critiqued, you still need to look at this moment, showing empathy for what people are going through and having the agility to act on it and to seize that moment is such a predictor of success. And I think along the way, it is so critical, though, that we just be aware of the risk in what we're saying and what we're communicating. And communications teams, marketing teams, leadership teams, especially now, since knowledge workers are working remotely, the risk of groupthink is high, right? The risk of not being as in touch as we usually are with the people who work for us and with us and that we serve if we're not in the in the business of providing essential services, there's a risk there, right? And so I think it's so critical that to avoid missteps like the cruise lines early in the pandemic failing to pull their ads about, showing people partying on ships, or the hilariously inappropriate finger-licking good ad that kept running in the UK from KFC, or Adidas' clumsy communication early in the pandemic to employees, suggesting bizarrely that it was more courageous to keep going into work and keep having contact with lots of people. These sorts of epic failures can be avoided and prevented by by avoiding groupthink, by listening to doubts and encouraging people to voice doubts and getting external perspective. Speaking of challenges, we're in a recession, right? And a lot of organizations have to deal with really complex issues that you don't have to deal with nearly as much when times are good, right? And so I guess my next takeaway is investing in crisis PR. PR in this case does not stand for public relations. The P stands for preparedness and prevention. The R for response and recovery. And so I'll ask you a question. In a study done some years ago of 78 crises at large internationally publicly traded companies over a 5-year period, the crises were the reason for the crisis was categorized into one of 4 types: behavioral, operational, corporate, and informational. Now, what do you think, which of these types of crises do you think had the biggest impact on the share price of the organization on day one? Okay, think for a moment. What's your answer to that question? All right, I'm assuming you have it. So if you said behavior, it was by far number 1, right? More than a 50% drop. Operations was number 2, right? And it's kind of surprising because you think, well, operationally something goes wrong, right? That's what causes a lot of crises, right? But of course, you probably knew, okay, a PR guy is presenting, it's got to be behavior. But if you said that, you're right, right? That if people believe that the values of the people running an organization are not aligned with theirs and are not the right values, even investors will be unforgiving, because they believe that will, over the long term, affect that company's market value. So what are smart organizations doing right now? They're doing scenario planning. And they're not just developing crisis plans that sit on a virtual shelf somewhere. They're taking it off the shelf and exercising them and simulating them. With some clients, we do this quarterly, right? Even now on Zoom, right? Quarterly fire drills where we'll simulate a crisis situation, to keep those skills sharp. Because most, as the last slide just showed, most of the impact of the crisis will be felt on the very first day. And if you don't get it right on the first day, the risk goes up exponentially. Probably the eeriest example I've had of this in my career was, it was 2013, working with Ontario's Electrical Safety Authority. It was May 2013, I'll never forget it, and you'll know why in a second, right? Because we did 2 full-day tabletop crisis simulations. And one thing that we simulated was an ice storm. And what do you think happened 7 months later, December of 2013, right? A massive ice storm that knocked out power across the province. And it was kind of eerie. Not across the province, across the Golden Horseshoe area, right? And boy, it was really so valuable that they'd invested that time in understanding the gaps in their crisis preparedness. The next thing I want to talk about is knowing your part in the big conversations we're having as a society, right? There are a series of big conversations that we're having. And I think it's really quite interesting because, if you look at the global financial crisis, the last major recession that we had to deal with more than a decade ago, you saw massive stimulus followed by austerity and then a huge increase in inequality. And I think right now, whether it's politicians or the left or the right or the center, there's little appetite for a repeat of that level of austerity, right? Government and businesses, though, at the time, they missed the opportunity to reset the economy in a carbon neutral way, right? And I see this idea of a green recovery, reducing carbon while generating jobs. I think that's taking hold in a lot of circles, right? And so, you can decide where your organization stands on this, but I think that you need a voice in this debate. The other big one, of course, right now is, of course, the call for and the explosion in the conversation around racial justice. And, you know, this has exploded in a way that I think is fundamentally good, right? But it's also incredibly challenging for leaders, not just as leaders, but as people, right? I mean, for me, I came to Canada as a Latin American immigrant when I was a kid, right? And it was a very white society. It was quite a racist society. This is early 70s. And my parents raised me never to talk about race, right? Just something you don't talk about that, right? But one thing I've come to really learn and appreciate in recent years, from working on equity issues in my own small way on boards and with clients, is that so many of us come from personal narratives that combine oppression and privilege. And as these images of racism and violence fill our screens, it can be hard for leaders who want to do the right thing, because you want to be, you want to speak out against what's happening, right? But at the same time, you feel like, I don't want to take up space. I want to give primacy to people from the most affected communities, right? And so a great equity trainer, you know, that I worked with about 10 years ago had a wonderful 3 words that she urged leaders to remember at these moments. It's not about feeling guilty, she said. It's about humility. It's about grief. It's about curiosity. And if you can bring those 3 values to the fore, and as Masai Ujiri, the president of the Raptors, said, you know, think first and foremost about how you respond as a person, and that will guide what you do for your organization and with your organization. And, you know, I've had a lot of conversations, as you can imagine, with leaders around this in recent months. And I think there are 6 predictors of success, right? And success is maybe the wrong word. It's, you know, of the response being well received, right? Number 1, it's got to come from the highest level of the organization. Number 2, the best communications are frank in naming the problems, using words like anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. The best responses aren't over the top, right? They're humble, they're self-reflective, they're maybe even self-critical. They go beyond mere statements of concern and solidarity, but they actually segue to tangible and measurable commitments. They're accountable, both internally and externally. And finally, they go beyond the organization. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. I mean, as many of you know, business schools are being challenged appropriately, you know, by their students and by their graduates, by their alumni on these issues. And yeah, it's important that every business school and every organization period look at this authentically. What do we need to do differently? And how do we change the way we listen and the way we act, the way we engage, the way we train, the way we recruit, the way we report, right? But I think there's also an opportunity, given that all the business schools are facing the same challenge, and in many industries, multiple players are, there's an opportunity for collaboration. And you know, the idea that Nike and Adidas supported each other publicly, like Nike had this line, just, you know, don't do it, don't accept racism, right? And Adidas then retweeted their fierce competitors' video and said, we're in this together, right? And so if Nike and Adidas, the most ferocious competitors in the world, among the most, can do this, you can in your industry too. Another big conversation that's coming is we're entering more protectionist times, right? We're living through an unraveling of global connections, fewer passenger flights, containers on ships, fewer exports, fewer imports, right? You know, global trust in the leadership of the big powers is declining. And a lot of the worst responses to the pandemic by leaders was characterized by, you know, narrow and parochial responses, selfish responses. But it's kind of the way of the world right now. And we have to think about this, right? Here's a survey Leger did, and they looked at intentions. Now, obviously, what people say and what they do may be different, but intentions by Canadians to buy Canadian, intentions by Americans to buy American, you know, going up, right? The prospect of a new Cold War that we seem to be entering, right? Now, is this remote from your business? I'd say it's not, right? And I think you've got to look very carefully at, you know, supply chain and travel risks, heightened public concern about data privacy and cybersecurity, scrutiny of where you're sourcing, your products and your food, consumer health, technology, investments, all of these areas. Concern about misinformation, I'll get there in a second, right? That could affect the decisions and behavior of your customers or your employees. Human rights risks, right? The experience of Asian Canadians, a lot of Asian Canadians during the pandemic has not been a very positive one. These folks work in our organizations, right? And the risk of racism at home, right, means this isn't just something that we can just say, oh, human rights risks, we're looking at them abroad. We have to look at them in our own workplaces and in our own communities too. And of course, probably an historically low tolerance for corporate virtue signaling that's not aligned and backed by tangible action. So that segues to the whole fake news question, right? You've got to be thinking about how you can fight misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation being unintentional, disinformation being intentional. And this touches a lot of businesses. And I think you need to have active monitoring systems in place to understand where there might be untruth and misinformation that could affect the health of your business, your employees, your customers, your communities, your stakeholders. A very obvious example is around vaccines. It's a big coming conversation. It's already with us, right? And you have some very high profile anti-vaxxers that are to be blunt and to be mild, to say it mildly, not advancing the cause of public health. There's a very smart guy, Paul Quigley, who came up with an analogy that I really liked, and it's that of a forest fire. That in a lot of operating environments, stakeholder environments, there are these tribes, like anti-vaxxers, for instance, right? And you have to think, who are the tribes that could generate misinformation that hurts us, or our customers or our employees? What are their pre-existing narratives, and what could happen, right? How could they contrive or distort events or moments that could hurt us, right? And increasingly, it's becoming so very hard to understand, even when you see a video on the internet, is this true or is this false, right? And of course, sometimes misinformation can come from sources that it shouldn't come from, right? And I don't mean to get political here, although it's hard not to these days. But when you had the current and with hope temporary holder of the office of president, touting treatments for COVID-19 again and again and again without evidence, most egregiously, talking about the possible injection of disinfectants into the human body, right? If you're listening to that, there's a risk for you, right? Do you speak out and do you challenge what the leader of the country in the US is saying if you're a US company? Well, here's what Lysol did, right? They said, well, they don't mention Trump's name anywhere here, but they say, look, due to recent speculation and social media activity, we've been asked whether internal administration of disinfectants may be appropriate, right? And they are very clear in saying under no circumstances. It's kind of amazing that they have to say this, but it's a smart and a responsible thing to do, even if it runs a risk, and even if it perhaps goes against the conventional wisdom of not commenting on politics, right? There's a time where you have to follow your values, and the risk of not speaking is greater than the risk of speaking. So building on that idea, I think that it's important to think about the relationships that you have in your stakeholder environment, external and internal, and I'm going to address both of these. There is an engagement imperative, right? We're in a world now where, this is a survey that Leger did with the Canadian Public Relations Society last week. It came out, right? The gray is Canadians, the red is communicators, right? And whether you're in my business or you're an ordinary member of the public, and not involved in communications, right? Look at the numbers. We're overwhelmed. Some of us feel that social media gives us an opportunity to have our voice heard. Many don't, right? We don't feel we have a voice. There's doubt and a split decision about whether businesses are behaving ethically. And look at this one. And this is something I've seen in my career. Think for a moment about your organization. How much of its resources, its communications and marketing resources, go into listening to your customers and stakeholders versus communicating outbound, right? I'll wager that if you're like most organizations, 90% of the resources go into the outbound, not the incoming. Are we surprised that businesses aren't trusted? And so that's why, we're increasingly saying, like, look, we have to think about how to measure relationships. And this is something we've been doing for the last 5 years, every year. You can find this on our website, argylepr.com. We do a study and we look at the quality and the health of relationships between a major economic sector and the public. And this year, not surprisingly, we looked at, I showed you a graph on this earlier, a couple of graphs. We looked at the relationship that Canadians have with one another, their governments, and their employers. So why is this important, right? Why should you care about this? Well, I'd say that relationships matter more than ever at times of elevated risk. That understanding a relationship and the health of that relationship, it's more complex and more enduring than satisfaction or approval ratings or even net promoter scores or something like that, right? That the relationship, combines the rational and the emotional. And of course, the research helps you understand the picture, but it's engagement that actually gives you a chance to change that picture. And it's so important, I believe, especially now when we're isolated, for leaders to get outside in perspectives, right? What are my stakeholders experiencing now? How could this affect us in a good way where we could see as the jump ball, or in a bad way that we have to respond to misinformation, right? How could this affect our communications? How can we exceed the expectations of our stakeholders in a creative way? How can we offer value and strengthen relationships? And I think that in some ways, and this is a chart from the International Association of Public Participation that our public engagement team, uses. External collaboration is important, and it's not just with our allies, right? I didn't coin the phrase hug your haters, but it's good advice, right? Sometimes you need to look at who are your worst critics, and is there an opportunity to show that you've listened to them and that you're collaborating with them? It may be hard to do, but I've been in my career amazed at how often and how surprising it can be when that happens, but also how powerful, right? One of my favorite examples about 10 years ago was bringing together a group of nutritionists and dietitians to speak with the makers of Wonder Bread, right? That they were constantly criticizing. Well, let's bring them together and talk about the challenges in making products healthier. And that led to changes in the product. And so this stuff can work. And I think that probably where we need to think about it the most as leaders right now is around our employees. Because I think there's a coming exchange. There's already an exchange of education and reputation. And let me tell you what I mean. I told you earlier, we did some research earlier in the year looking at the health of the employer-employee relationship, right? And we thought, well, it's going to be crap, right? Because people are worried about their jobs, and a lot of people have lost their jobs, and we're serving the general public, right? And I'll show you the numbers in a moment, but I think in 2020 and 2021, employees are going to drive the reputation, right? How you are perceived to have treated your employees at this time will drive your reputation next year. Questions like, well, did you put them first? Did you work hard to keep them safe? Did you show you cared about their mental health and wellness? Were you transparent about how your business is doing, right? And did you engage and enable them to be part of the solution? And probably most fundamentally, did they live their values? Are the values just something that's on the wall when you walk in? Or is it something that people actually put into their practice every day? And if employees drive reputation, the other part of it is, I think, increasingly, particularly with younger workers, I'm seeing this, since, our employees tend to be, millennials and very soon even younger. It's that, like, unlike people of my generation, the attachment to the traditional media, to the, like, I still get a daily newspaper on my step every morning, and I still actually read it, right? And so my attachment and my generation's attachment to traditional news and information sources and institutions and is much stronger. And so employers, I think, can play a very vital role right now in helping people sift through all the conflicting advice that's out there on mainstream and social media about the advice they should believe, and what they need to do to stay safe. And then within the business, how they can be part of the solution. Now here are the numbers I promised you, right? People's relationships, this is early in the pandemic, mind you, they improved with their coworkers. They improved with their employer. They improved with the local businesses that they deal with every day. Look at that, plus 27, plus 20, plus 14, right? Net improvement. And so we wanted to know, though, is this just like, soldiers huddling together in a foxhole because there's a common danger out there and it's not really built on an authentic and deep relationship? Well, actually, our research found that the employer-employee relationship, it's arguably one of the greatest intangible assets we have in Canada today, right? Because on all of these numbers that go deeper, satisfaction with your employer, the belief that your employer takes care of people who work there, trust, concern about people like me, are they committed to meet your expectations? In all of these dimensions, the relationships between Canadian employees and employers is very strong. The only one where employers are weak is that employees don't believe that they can influence their employer's decisions and directions. And I find that kind of interesting, because isn't that the easiest one to change? I mean, can you make somebody trust you if they don't trust you now? Can you make them instantly more, satisfied with you, right? Can you instantly persuade them that, you care about people like them? That's hard. Those numbers take a while to move. But I would argue that you can do things tomorrow in your business that can enhance the way you listen to your employees, that can help you make changes and feed those changes back to your employees and show what you've done and how you've acted on that advice. Let them influence your decisions. The bond will be even stronger. The retention will be higher. The business will be healthier. And it's interesting because I think this is the last graph I'll show you after showing you so many. We did a LinkedIn survey of, this is more informal, of course, it's just, people responding to us, on LinkedIn. But it was interesting that, professional communicators responding to our survey, the number one thing that they believe will be important to supporting organizational reputation in the next 12 to 18 months, employee engagement, right? Executive thought leadership, number 2, brand communication, number 3, right? So it's important, and it's never been more important. So I think it's a huge opportunity. The strength of that relationship, it's mutually essential. There's an opportunity to give employees influence because it's easy to change. And look, if you think of yourself and the way you respond to this crisis, in times of crisis and change, we fear that we lack autonomy over these great external events shaping our lives. And so anything we can do to give people a sense of engagement and influence, if not control, because we'll never have control anymore, none of us will. But if we have influence, that's a start. And that makes us feel more powerful, and that helps us act more courageously. So to sum up my advice in a slide, watch that rolling reality. Forget about the new normal. Seize that jump ball moment, as Brian advised us to do on that previous webinar. Be crisis ready. Be part of these big conversations that we're facing in society. Monitor misinformation that could affect your business and the health and wellness and well-being of your people and your clients. Strengthen those external stakeholder relationships, even with people who are your critics, and engage your employees to build that internal relationship capital. And when you deal with people like me, challenge us. Challenge us not just to give you communications impact, but to give you business impact, right? Because there is an inextricable connection between communications metrics, brand and reputation impact, and business impact, right? Whether it's selling more products, whether it's attracting more investment because investors understand your value creation story, and the risks and how you're managing reputation risks and relationship and stakeholder risks in your operating environment, whether it's being able to command a higher margin because your brand is stronger, whether it's in reducing churn, in your workforce or among your customers. And of course, the intangible one, which you can never fully know, is how the action you take and the investments you make now might lower risk and prevent costs that you'll never know that you might have incurred because the issue that you manage today never became a crisis. So along the way, leaders need certain capabilities. They need empathy, they need foresight, they need agility, they need objectivity, and they need courage. And it is a time to step up. It's a time for courage to engage, to communicate, to lead, and to turn an old phrase on its head. Silence isn't golden, right? It's a time to listen, but it's also a time to be heard. And in the 30 years I've been doing this kind of work, I've seen way more risk come from saying too little than from saying too much. So I want to thank you for your time today and for the honor of addressing friends and alumni of Smith School of Business. And I'd be delighted to take your questions now and to continue the conversation in the weeks, months, and years to come. Meredith, thank you, and I'll turn it back to you.
Hi, Dan, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, I'm going to probe a little bit, if you may, because you said a lot of fantastic things at a very high level. I'm wondering if you could get into a little bit more detail, specifically about, you talked about how companies can exercise crisis simulation plans, but how does a company do that? What's the best, does that just mean like you spend a day around a boardroom, or can you talk more about what that process would be for people to understand?
Sure. So I think there are various parts to it, right? There's developing the crisis communications model, like how are you going to manage the crisis, right? So what does your crisis plan look like? Who's in it? What are the different roles? How are you going to centralize communication? How are you going to understand the evolving situation? Prepare your chief executive, to respond quickly and early, even as you're gathering information. So there are all those mechanics. But what I find, having worked with leaders an awfully long time, and I go back my early days, I worked for 2 cabinet ministers in the first almost a decade in my first 7 or 8 years of my career. So I've seen it in the public sector and the private sector. And when there's a crisis, the leader's first instinct is to get all the information, right? It's not to communicate until they know the situation they're facing. But yet the world is waiting. And even now more than ever, in the social media environment, the worst thing that can happen is others taking the stage, taking the floor with rumors or speculation or attacks on you, right? And so how you respond, as I said before, is really, really critical. So what do we try to train? We try to train a leader's psychological readiness as well as their organizational readiness. And so what that looks like is often a tabletop crisis simulation where you have people around that table representing, it can be a leadership team, but it can also be mid-level people as well, representing different spheres within the organization. So you might have human resources, communications, legal, operations, et cetera, government affairs. So you have the different disciplines represented. You introduce a crisis simulation, and then you see how they react, right? And then you introduce new variables. Okay, the premier is on the line, wants an update about what you're doing, right? What are you going to say? Who's going to talk to them, right? And so we ratchet up the pressure. And then afterwards, we have a conversation where we look at where are the gaps. So that's typically how it works. And there are a lot of firms like mine that do this kind of work, but it's certainly something that's very much in demand right now.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. In terms of countering misinformation, which you touched on later, not all companies are going to be like Lysol, putting up a by the way, don't inject yourself with bleach.
Yes.
But what can companies do? What is the best way to counter misinformation? I mean, how do you do? Like, all companies are all different. How does one tackle that very big and sort of frightening issue?
Well, I think it starts with getting the right data, right? Like having the right tools in place, right? So there are a lot of tools out there that'll monitor, media coverage, and there are a lot of tools that will measure social media sentiment. But you need to go a level deeper, and you need to understand the momentum of an issue, not just the snapshot and the sentiment of right now. You need to look at it more longitudinally and look at what is that conversation and what's the risk level to us based on people's current state of knowledge or information. So let me give an example from long ago, and this will date me a little bit, but I remember I was advising the city of Toronto around Y2K, right? So this is exactly 20 years ago. And I was their Y2K communications consultant, and we were developing a Y2K communication strategy. And so we did a poll, and it showed that, something like 80% of people believed that everything would be okay when the date changed, right? But then you ask a little more. You say, well, will the transit work? Will the hydro stay on, right? Will the water work? Will the different services work? Belief went down 10%, right? So we knew it wouldn't take much. It would just take one credible person saying this isn't going to be ready before people start, stocking up on bottled water and firewood, right? And so we had to do high-profile things which showed people the truth and the facts of the city's readiness, right? So that's just an example for you.
It occurred to me that there could be people watching who have no idea what you're talking about. But
Y2K was meant to be Armageddon, right? Because computers, weren't invented to give you 4 digits. They were only given, so 99 becomes 00, and the computers don't work anymore.
Those of us who remember, but
Well, just clarify that. But so what we had to do though is we said, okay, we're going to tell all the media that we're moving the clocks on the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, up to simulate the date change 6 months before. The trains are going to stop in the station, right? We invited all the media to go down and be there, and obviously it was a risk, but it worked, right? And so it's stuff like that enhanced public confidence that we will be ready, right?
So getting ahead of the misinformation.
Getting ahead, and then dealing with stuff like a city councillor who was the chair of the Y2K Readiness Committee, if you can believe it. He says, well, I believe everything will be ready, but, just in case, I'm stocking up on bottled water and firewood, right? And so, so there you go, a credible person in charge of the city's readiness, encouraging people to go and buy bottled water and firewood, right? And so, so we ended up developing an information campaign called Be Prepared, Not Scared, right? Which was saying, well, while we're confident that Y2K is unlikely to be anything more than an inconvenience, right? We encourage you to be ready for any winter emergency. So here are the things you need to do to get ready for a winter emergency. So it's lowering the temperature with facts and knowledge, and then doing things which actually prove the assertions that you're making.
Right. And for anyone who's watching and who wasn't conscious, Y2K was a total letdown. Because everyone was prepared. Question from Katrina. Where does corporate purpose live within this moment of rolling reality? Liked your comment about company virtue signaling. Thanks.
Yeah. I think the movement to corporate purpose and the focus on that, it is absolutely critical right now. Because as I said before, it is a moment where we will remember the organizations and the brands that stood up, that helped us, that showed empathy, and that did creative things to deliver value, right? And to show their own values. And so I think that it would be a terrible mistake to think that, oh, well, we've got to, focus on just the basics, right? Actually, that's not the case, right? All the research shows that people care more than ever about the purpose and the values of an organization and those who lead that organization. And we're seeing it in these big conversations, right? Why is the NFL all of a sudden talking about Black Lives Matter, right? This stuff, we've reached a tipping point, I think, where because the economic value of brand and reputation is so high, the only thing I can think of that would be comparable would be intellectual property as an intangible asset. Then, it becomes really critical to find a point of differentiation. And that's a really powerful point of differentiation. And it's one that's very visible. And that increasingly the boundary between internal communications and external communications is becoming very porous, right? And, look at the example I showed you about Adidas, right? Posting that ridiculous advice, to its employees internally. Well, it's around the world, right? A moment later, right? And so you look at brands like Nike, for instance, its competitor, and the way they were able to wade into the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter, protests and that, and to comment thoughtfully in that moment, but to do so with credibility. Well, it's because they had actually done tangible things that that showed their values in action. You know, they were the ones who signed Colin Kaepernick to a contract when no one else, when none of the NFL teams would sign him, right? And so they get an enduring credibility from that. Netflix was able to enter this debate with some credibility because they have had programs that prioritize or create opportunities for content creators from marginalized communities, right? And so you make those, you define your purpose, you invest in the purpose, not just talking about it, but doing things aligned with that purpose, and you get the reward you deserve down the road.
Right.
It's worth the investment.
Okay, well put, thank you. Hi Dan, great advice and insights. How would you advise influencing a leadership team that has responded to a brand crisis with a more defensive / factual response rather than showing empathy and acknowledging wrongdoing? And then follows with, what does it take to convince them there's a better way?
Well, you know, it's data, right? You know, and it's a great question, and it's something I often struggle. I often hear that question from people who lead in-house marketing and communications teams, and so I go back to one of the last slides I showed about, you know, how the more on an ongoing basis the marketing or communications team can show, especially the communications team, I should say, because marketing, it's easier to see the impact, right? Communications, can you stop the crisis from happening because you manage it well on day one, right? You know, you're saving the organization a lot, but it's not measurable, right? And so, but to the extent that you can develop a culture and a structure and a strategy and metrics that show the business impact, that you're not just saying, you know, here's how many web visits we got or how many people took part in the conversation, but you can show correlation with positive business outcomes. You know, you're not going to be able to persuade them with one magic argument on one day, right? It's a matter of building that culture and that credibility internally over time. And sometimes, though, I find, you know, it is helpful to just to do a competitive analysis, look at what competitors are doing. And remember, too, that sometimes we don't, it's not enough to look within your own industry, right? Because, you know, there are some industries, you know, airlines just being one example, where generally public ratings of every player in the industry are not very good, right? But look at the ratings that the public has, the people you care about, the customers you're trying to reach, care about in other sectors that are important to them, right? And look at how it shapes their purchasing habits, their investment habits, et cetera, right? And I guess if there's one last thing I'll say is do an employee survey. You know, ask the employees and, you know, how they feel about how the company responded and what the company should be doing. They'll tell you.
Right, good advice. This person is asking you to bring out your crystal ball, but I'm going to toss it to you anyway and see what you think. Ankar asks, how and when do you see the healthcare industry, which is most affected by, obviously, COVID-19, recovering? How and when?
The healthcare industry recovering.
Recovering from this pandemic, the crisis.
Yeah, well, I guess it's tough to speculate on whether the question is referring to like hospitals and like frontline providers or kind of the business side of healthcare technology. But I mean, I think that the health industry is one of the industries right now that has among the greatest opportunities, I think, right? I mean, we do a lot of work in the pharma industry, for instance. Pharma is not, you know, pharma is one of those sectors like airlines that I alluded to earlier that, you know, people don't trust very much, right? And so I think there's an opportunity right now for pharma companies to build very strong partnerships with disease advocates, patient advocacy groups, research institutions, to show the value and the work of what they're doing to build reputation and brand. So I know I'm a little far from the question, but I think that the healthcare industry will be incredibly resilient, and that provided that it can adapt to, you know, the very changed environment that we face now, with people being much more comfortable in a good way with telemedicine, I think there's a real opportunity there.
Right, great, thank you. Finally, we've got a question which I think is asking, what's one method that businesses who may have been accustomed to doing something in a certain way prior to the pandemic should be changing now in order to demonstrate better brand and reputation management in times of crisis? I think that's the question.
Sorry, can you ask it again, Meredith? I didn't quite follow.
I'm interpreting it. Jebby, if you're listening, you can just tell me if I've got this right. So what's one method the businesses who may have been practicing in a particular way prior to the pandemic, they may have been doing something a particular way, should be changing now in order to exercise better brand and reputation management in this time of crisis? Is there one area where companies, if they could pick one thing to really focus on and get them through this time of crisis and come out well on the other end, what would it be?
Well, I guess if I had to pick one thing, it's employee engagement. If I had to pick two things, it's employee engagement and a really effective and really ramping up your systems for listening to your external stakeholders, right? Like it's anything you can do to through research, to gain empathy for what your public, your audiences, your customers, your stakeholders, what they're going through right now, right? What their worries are, what their unmet needs are, right? And then having the agility and even, I think, making changes that you need to make to your structures and your cultures to reward managers who act nimbly and even take risks to pursue an opportunity to build those relationships and to show values and demonstrate value. So I would focus more on the culture than the structure. And I think the leader needs to tell everybody that I want better data about my stakeholders and what they're going through internally and externally. And I want to reward those who act on those insights.
Okay, wonderful. We are almost out of time. The questions are just coming in. So I'm going to throw this one last one at you, and then I got to do my spiel, and then we got to wrap this thing. Hi, Dan. Thanks for the fee something presentation. How/where? I think it was good. Where would you use
some F words aren't so good. So.
Freet presentation, but I think it's a typo. Great. I'm guessing it's a great presentation. How/where would you use analytics in the middle of this for making decisions in this context?
Well, I think I think that more and more every communications decision ideally is rooted in data and analytics, right? And we have got so many great tools now, as I alluded to earlier, to understand not just sentiment, but to understand momentum, to understand what people are going through, and to act on them, right? And so I think it's a matter of, identifying the metrics that matter, and just kind of developing kind of dashboards for senior leaders that can help them make those decisions. And when you deal with people like me, don't expect them to sit there, listen to your challenge and say sagely, here's what I think you should do, right? I think you need to respect people who say, here's my initial perspective. I think we've got two options, but let's do some research and I'll tell you which one is going to resonate more, right? And so what we're doing much more now is we're saying, okay, there are two messages. Okay, we want to improve public compliance with, whatever. We want more people to download the COVID-19 app on their phones, right? What message is going to work, right? Rather than my saying, well, in my experience, here's the turn of phrase that's the magic one, which is the old way, right? It's let's test three messages, right? And let's see which one has the most traction, right? And now we can do that sort of testing very, very quickly. So I think identifying the metrics that matter, putting the dashboards in place, and then testing quickly and in an agile way before you deliver your message to your audience.
So analytics are everything.
They are. Analytics and empathy. Analytics and empathy. The human side remains more critical than ever.
That's what we're taking away from today's presentation, everybody. Analytics and empathy. Can't go wrong. All right, now's when I have to do my spiel and sell other programs and training opportunities to people. Lots of opportunities for online learning at Smith School of Business, as you probably everybody knows this, but if you want to become an even better coach or leader, Queen's Executive Education has a number of programs that might be just the thing. This is a great time for online learning. We are all stuck in our homes. So we've got some good programs coming up, including the flagship Queen's Leadership Program, as well as programs like Leading Through Crisis and Strategic Planning and Leading Change. So these are good times to really brush up on your skills if you're working from home, because all of these programs are available in an online and remote format. And you can visit the URL that's on that screen in front of you, smithqueens.com/execed. So in terms of our next presentation, so we're doing an every other week format, so every 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, we'll be back Wednesday, October 7th. And we're going to be talking about the business of healthcare and health policy in the wake of COVID-19. And I think we do have some pretty good guests lined up for that panel. So I hope that people will be able to join us for that one. Dan, this is the moment where I say thank you for being fantastic, for being part of the Queen's community, the Smith community. We're really appreciative of your insights. And I know that our audience has surely gained a lot from what you're able to share with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Meredith. It's been a great pleasure.
Great, and thanks to our audience, as usual, for tuning in. As I said at the beginning, you will be getting this recording in your inbox. Do share it with your friends and colleagues. Lots of great insights to take away from this. On behalf of Smith School of Business, thanks everybody for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Bye.